Thank you very much. Disregard the genius part, okay? I want to lower expectations. Failure, in this case, makes for repeated efforts. Let's try persistence. Good morning, everybody. It is a pleasure to be back. This is my favorite conference. I love being here because the audience is always so interesting and so engaged. But I need to know a little bit more about who's in the audience today. How many of you are elementary educators? Raise your hands. Secondary educators, raise your hand. Ooh, lots of those. Post-secondary, raise your hand. Do we have any business folks? Tragic. Not a single hand. Tragic. Let's see. How many of you are parents, past, present, or future? Raise your hand. Lots of those. How many of you are concerned citizens? It's a trick question. You could be more than one. A couple people back there did not have their hands up. I'm a little bit concerned. All right. This is very relevant. I'll explain to you in a moment. But first, I want to show you a short 3-minute video. It kind of begins to set the figurative stage for our conversation this morning. And I promise you it will be a conversation. Lots of time for Q&A. So let's roll that video, please. My colleague, Ted Dintersmith, put that together for his recent book. And he made that film before AI had been developed. AI now radically changes the conversation. And that's part of what we're going to talk about today. But let's back up a minute. Big picture. The purposes of education. I'm writing a new book with colleagues. Actually, my memoir was my last book, Learning by Heart. It came out a year and a half ago. But I'm writing a new book called Mastery, The Future of Learning in Schools and the Workplace. And we've been sort of looking at the big picture, first of all. What's the purpose of education? Now, if we had time, I'd love to engage you in groups and have you report out, but we don't. So you might think about it for a minute for yourselves if you had to answer the purposes of education. But the three of us answered it in the following way. The purposes of education are first to prepare all young people for meaningful, productive work. When you see this, you begin to realize we already have a problem. Secondly, education must prepare all young people for active and informed citizenship and civic engagement. Lastly, we believe all young people must be prepared for personal health and well-being in education. 3 goals. All right, so here's the question. Audience participation question. How many would you give our education system, let me be clear, not the teachers, the system. In many respects, we teachers are as much victims of the system as our students. How many would you give our education system, K-16, an A on 3 purposes of education? Let the record show I do not see a single hand. How many would give it a B? Raise your hands. Not a single hand. I've never done this before. I have to tell you, I'm shocked. C. Okay, we got a lot of C's. I'm going to skip D for a minute. That's a meaningless grade. Failing grade. How many would give it failing grade? Some fair number would give you a failing grade. Well, let me tell you a story and give you some data points, and we'll see if your grade might change with this knowledge. I'll tell you the story of Monica. She is a 48-year-old African-American woman, single mom. She grew up in a suburb of Cleveland. Her dad was a laid-off steel worker. Her mom was a licensed practical nurse. She went to a predominantly African-American high school, honor society, you name it, student government, the whole deal. Really great student. Did dance, did band, couldn't ask for more. Did an internship at a bank when she graduated. But more than anything, her parents wanted her to go to college, right? American dream. Well, only about 17% of kids from her high school went to college, and of those, nearly a quarter needed remediation. But she went. She got in and graduated from a small liberal arts college. The good news? Horatio Alger's story, you think, maybe? Well, she got pegged for customer service because of her internship at a bank after high school. What did that mean? She worked in call centers for 20 years, one after the other, after the other. Earning an average of $17, $18 an hour, couldn't afford to pay back her college debt, which by the time she was in her mid-40s had accumulated to $97,000. Depression, anxiety, I mean, you can begin to imagine. But then she got lucky. She found out about a program called Perscolas, nonprofit that teaches underemployed and unemployed minority youth real skills. She went through this 12-week program. She became certified as a threat analyst for the internet, learned communication skills, learned to collaborate, got career counseling, graduated into a job with a startup doing threat analysis, earning 5x what she had previously earned, and finally beginning to be able to pay back her debt. Unusual story? Something odd about this story? I don't think so. Let me give you a couple of data points. We graduate 90% of our high school kids, theoretically. You know, gosh knows what those kids are able to do. But we graduate 90%. Of that 90%, 60% go to college, right? Of that 60% graduate from 4-year schools. 40% graduate from the 2-year schools they attend. So let me make those numbers really easy for you. You got 100 high school kids. About 56 graduate. 33 get some kind of degree. But here's the really relevant question. Of those who finally graduate, how many get a job that enables them to pay back the average of $37,000 of college debt? How many? I mean, we talk about a full employment economy, oh boy, 3.8% under unemployment. What is our underemployment rate? Anybody want to guess? Guess. It's 45%. Underemployed. Underemployed is defined as somebody who has a job that technically requires a BA, but doesn't pay a BA wage. Not even a living wage. 45%. And that has been true for more than 25 years. 40 to 45%. So you take those 100 kids who went to high school, how many are left actually having a real job that pays a real wage? 16. 16 out of that 100. Then let's say, all right, that's education for work. We're not doing so well there. What about education for civic engagement? Well, in high school, 19 states require kids to memorize basic elements of a civics test. What is a civics test to ask? You might want to know. Well, how many amendments are there? Raise your hands if you know how many amendments we have. I thought not. Well, you're disqualified immediately as citizens, sorry. But you can tell me surely who wrote the Declaration of Independence, right? That's what we call civics education in this country. And we wonder why we have the incredible crisis that we have today in our political sphere. How many kids have learned to critically evaluate an argument, to weigh evidence? How many could even be an effective juror? Are we graduating all high school students jury ready? I don't think so. Well, what about personal health and well-being? The third goal. How are we doing there? How many of you are familiar with Jonathan Hatt's latest book, The Anxious Generation? A couple of us. Wow, I thought we had a problem. I had no idea how bad it was. Hatt has collected the research on adolescents' mental health and well-being. 50% increase in rates of anxiety and depression in the last decade among adolescents. Triple suicide rate since 2007. 22% obesity rate among adolescents. Anybody want to change their grade? Our education system, I believe, failing may be an unfair term. Let's just say obsolete. Hopelessly obsolete. It was created at the dawn of the 20th century. Well, let's look at a couple of factors in our design that are fatally flawed. Number one, how do we measure learning in schools? Carnegie units, right? What's a Carnegie unit? It is 120 credit hours of seat time served. How do we measure learning in college? Call them Carnegie hours. Credit hours. Same concept exactly. Why did all that happen? Because the Carnegie system was created to standardize learning in high school and college. Back then, at the turn of the 20th century, it was all chaos, all kinds of things going on in all kinds of schools. And so a commission was created. Charles Eliot, president of Harvard, chaired it. And they said, well, we're going to standardize learning. And by gosh, we're going to standardize it by units of time. That's the best way to standardize it. Can't do it any other way. Little problem. We now know that people learn at different rates. Even more importantly, we know that people can serve their seat time and yet have not mastered core competencies. Monique, whose story I just told you, describes her high school and college diplomas as certificates of attendance. She said she learned no skills. She told me she didn't even know how to correctly punctuate a sentence when she started college. She'd done almost no writing. Well, what about the other problem here? The other problem is that we've invented a system at an age of knowledge scarcity, right? There weren't a lot of public libraries. The internet hadn't been invented. And so we really focused on enabling students to master a body of content knowledge that we thought would serve them a lifetime. Fill them up, right? And they'll stay filled up and use that knowledge. Well, as you and I know, that doesn't work for several reasons. Number one, they don't retain what they learn. We now know, because of learning science, that people do not retain knowledge that they don't use, that they don't apply. Secondly, they don't retain knowledge for which they don't have a scaffolding, a framework, a set of concepts. And Keith Sawyer is going to talk a lot more sort of effectively about these things than I in the second keynote coming. But the point here is we have privileged memorization of academic content knowledge. Knowledge is important. Let me be very, very clear. Knowledge matters. But in the 21st century, skills matter more, and motivation matters most. And so we're privileging academic content knowledge that students don't apply, don't know how to use, and don't retain, at the expense of their motivation to learn. The longer kids are in school, well, let me be clear. Let's start with kids are born curious, creative, imaginative. That's the human DNA. The average 5-year-old asks 100 questions a day. How many of you have kids or grandkids about that age? So you can testify, right? I have 4 grandkids. Questions all the time. Wonderful. But then something happens. We call it school. Because the longer kids are in school, the fewer questions they have. The more they become obsessed with getting the right factual answers to the right trivial pursuit questions. So the challenge here is to fundamentally reimagine the architecture of learning and schools in the 21st century, to reinvent it. And we have to lead the way, because policymakers don't understand. They don't know. And we have been too timid as a profession for far too long. So let's start talking about what we can do, what we should be doing, what educators around the country and even around the world, in fact, are doing today. Kentucky, Jason Glass leadership, superintendent was until recently, superintendent of instruction in Kentucky, said, all right, we want to, first of all, have a listening campaign. They went all over the state asking ordinary citizens, no blue ribbon commissions, what are the purposes of education? Ordinary citizens say, I want kids to leave school with skills. I want kids to leave school engaged, excited to learn. Basics, fundamentals. And what skills? Well, over and over again, the skills are basically the same. Critical and creative thinking, over and over. Effective oral and written communication, absolutely. The ability to work collaboratively, couldn't be much simpler. And finally, character and citizenship skills. These are the things that citizens want from us and our schools. So what has happened in Kentucky is that high schools and elementary schools have created in each community their own profiles of a graduate, where they, after community-based conversations, talk about the outcomes that matter most. And this is the first step in resetting. Even for you in your individual classes, you can do this. Sit down and say, all right, a year after my class is over, what do I want my kids to retain, to know? What do I want them to have mastered or have gotten better at a year after the class is over? Just ask yourself that question when you plan your next unit of study, and then talk to the students about it and tell them why you think these are the things that are important. I did this as a high school teacher, and it made a fundamental difference no matter who I was teaching, and I taught opposite ends of the spectrum for about 5 years each. So that's the first step. Then we have to think about assessments. How do we assess the skills and the ability to apply knowledge? You know, for too many years, because of Nation at Risk, beginning in the 80s, and then going on to No Child Left Behind, Race to the Top, blah, 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 we have been data-driven. And it has profoundly undermined effective learning and teaching. But we cannot shy away from the argument about accountability. So instead of being data-driven, let's talk about being evidence-based, not data-driven. What does it mean to be evidence-based? We develop assessments of core competencies. We develop digital portfolios. Every student should have a digital portfolio that follows them through school. Beyond that, we engage students in being able to explain what they've learned and why they've learned it. In Kentucky, after they did these profiles of a graduate, they then initiated what they called defenses of learning, where students at different grade levels, seniors, exiting 8th graders, exiting 5th graders, given the profile of the graduate that their communities had developed, had to talk about their learning through the year as it related to the skills that were outlined and dispositions of character that were outlined in the profile of a graduate. See, that's a part of why we have to move back from data to evidence, right? If we say part of learning is developing character, as Angela Duckworth, my friend, says, there's no standardized test for good character. We have to clearly define what we mean by that and why is it important. Angela had a stunning newsletter that came out just last Sunday. You can find it, I'm sure, on our website, where she said character is 3 things. It's qualities of heart. Interpersonal skills is what she meant. Compassion, empathy, understanding your civic responsibilities. That's 1. Number 2, qualities of mind. She called it intellectual virtues. The ability to think critically, being curious, inquisitive, thinking critically. And the 3rd was qualities of will, and I call that intrapersonal skills. Grit, perseverance, tenacity, self-regulation, self-discipline. These outcomes are every bit as important as core competencies. In fact, they're the same qualities of character you need for work, citizenship, as well as, and most importantly, personal health and well-being. Well, where's the standardized test for that? Where's your school score on character? Most schools haven't even been able to meaningfully get together and ban cell phones from the classroom. That's how challenged we are right now. So this is the conversation we need to have with ourselves, within our profession, and with our communities. And as I say, this is happening all over the US and around the world, and it's moving up into the college domain. I interviewed a provost of the University of Kansas who wants to be the first land-grant university to develop competency-based curricula for all of her classes. She said, look, when kids take, I don't know, molecular biology, I don't want them to think they're taking molecular biology as a subject. I want them to understand they are learning the scientific method, how to develop a hypothesis, how to design a study to test that hypothesis, how to present the result, and analyze and present the results. She said the same thing in English. She said when they're studying Shakespeare, what they need to be learning are the core competencies of critical analysis, no matter what they're reading, as well as the capacity to empathize. So she wants to transform all of the courses at University of Kansas. I'm on the board of something called the Mastery Transcript Consortium. It is a nonprofit that came out into being in 2017. It is developing an entirely different kind of high school transcript that is reporting core competencies using a unique matrix. You can go to mastery.org and see an example of it. But what's so fascinating about it, you've got a 1-page summary of the students' core skills and how deeply they've gone with different ones, how proficient they are. Think of it as the merit badge approach to learning. It's a series of merit badges embodied in a transcript. But the neat thing is you click on each one of these so-called merit badges, say communication skills, and it takes you straight into the student's digital portfolio where you see evidence of their work. What did they have to do to show proficiency? What were the performance standards? We talk about content standards. What about the performance standards? What should the performance standards be for a high school graduate in communication skills, for example? Should they all have to write a persuasive essay? Should they all have to write an effective email, do an analysis of 2 different authors, or more importantly, write an op-ed? I had my kids do all those things. They had to write an op-ed, letter to the editor, and actually mail it to a newspaper. So it's a shift in thinking that we have to do, and we can do it classroom by classroom. But I think it's important to also do it community by community. And we're beginning to gather real support for this effort. Most of you may not have known that a year ago, the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching, Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching, by the way, were the group that invented the Carnegie Unit. Did you know that? Why is it called the Carnegie Unit, you might wonder? Funny, you should ask. I'll tell you why. So, Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching said, we're going to have Carnegie Units, we're going to have credit hours, we're going to solve this messy problem of no standardization in education. This is 1907. And everybody said, well, geez, how are you going to get them to adopt this new program? They said, simple. We have Andrew Carnegie here on our team. He was on the committee, very rich guy. And Andrew Carnegie said, well, I'm going to set up a retirement annuity fund for all educators. All educators. And the only requirement is, I'm going to offer it to every college, and the only requirement is you're going to have to use credit hours in college, and you're going to have to use Carnegie units for admission of high school kids to college. Then you can join my new teacher's retirement fund. How many of you today are members of TIAA-CREF? That's it. That Carnegie fund became TIAA-CREF. So you'd say, all right, oh my gosh, the Carnegie system, the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching are the bad guys, right? Well, they had just joined with another bad guy, ETS, Educational Testing Service. They have said, we are committed to abolishing the Carnegie Unit, abolishing it, and replacing it with assessments of core competencies. They have seen the handwriting on the wall. Harvard hasn't, Dartmouth hasn't, Penn hasn't. They're all reinstituting SATs. Whereas the Educational Testing Service knows SATs are going away because they don't measure what matters most. They measure basic attributes and knowledge that you need to get through the first year of college, but not, as we've just discovered, to get a meaningful job, to contribute meaningfully in your community, to live a life of health and growth and well-being. So there is a movement afoot. It is gathering momentum and is critically important that we all become involved and engaged, because the future of our country and the future of our children are what at stake. AI is going to gobble up more and more jobs. The skill that will matter most today and into the future is the ability to solve new problems. That's what an innovator does, solves problems, or to create new knowledge. So in some very meaningful sense, we have to graduate every student from every class that we teach innovation ready, because that is the only assurance that they can have meaningful work, be a productive citizen, and live a life of personal health and well-being based on creating, not consuming. This is the challenge we have. We're going to move more to an apprenticeship-based system. Fewer kids are going to college today, many fewer. So the challenge will be, how do we keep the best of liberal arts education? The liberal arts college graduates' outcomes are better health, more likely to vote, more tolerant, more able to keep a job, stay married. All those things are outcomes of four-year colleges that increasingly fewer and fewer kids will ever go to. So how are we going to ensure that those outcomes happen at the end of high school or at the end of any apprenticeship program? These are some of the core challenges that I'm wrestling with, that I see us today needing to engage in conversation about. We're writing a book, Mastery, The Future of Learning in Schools and the Workplace. It'll be out in about a year, where we're really trying to wrestle with these core questions. Speaking of questions, I want to hear yours. I can't wait. This is my favorite part of the conversation, where I get to hear your questions and comments. But before we do that, I'm going to ask you to engage in your neighbor right now. Take 3 or 4 minutes. I want you to talk to your neighbor about one thought you've had so far in the morning. And most importantly, one question that you have. So share with your neighbor one thought, one idea that you're taking away so far, and one question. Then we'll come back to you. You're getting the questions on Zoom. Great. So you tell me. I will. Yeah. That's great, please. Plenty of time. Teaching. Just teaching. One more minute. One more minute, and you can begin lining up at the mics, please. Okay, folks. Sorry you didn't find anything worth talking about. What a shame. There are 4 mics spread throughout the room. Don't be shy. Come on up. Please keep your questions or comments brief so we can get as many in as possible. Yes, ma'am.
So one of the things that we were talking about, from a private school and from a public school perspective, is that really looking at public schools, you're bound by state and federal mandates, where in some private schools where you start to see some of this type of work, that restriction is not there. And how do we meld those two worlds enough for our students within the public school sector to get those same kind of experiences?
Yeah. That's a really important question. Although having taught myself in both, I think there are other restrictions on private schools, not from the state, but from the parents and the selective schools, right? So I don't know fundamentally which is freer. Of course, independent schools theoretically are independent, but I think very few of them take advantage of that. Now, having said that, we are beginning to see some movement at the state level. Next month in June, I'm speaking to all the superintendents of the state of Maine. The title of the conference is Measuring What Matters Most. States are moving. Jason Glass in Kentucky, developing alternative assessments, using performance assessments, using portfolios. So we're beginning to see movement, but this is why I said earlier, we educators have to become powerful advocates for a better system of accountability that does measure what matters most, that does weigh different kinds of evidence. I want to see every educator have a button or a bumper sticker. Hold me accountable for what matters most. That needs to be our mantra. Yes, please.
Hi, I'm from Canada, so my context's a little bit different from Manitoba.
Welcome.
Thank you. And so my question is all of these skills and the motivation and these competencies are definitely really important, and they're things that we do in Manitoba have the opportunity to focus on. We don't necessarily report on them, so that would be our next step. But we have adults entering our buildings as teachers and educational assistants and paraprofessionals, all of those things, without these skills. So how do we expedite the adult learning so that they can teach these children what matters most? What would be your suggestion? How do we begin that?
Geez, that's a wonderful question. I'm sorry, I have to go. I hear my plane calling. Quite seriously. Here's one thought. Education is arguably the most isolated profession in modern work life. We work alone all day with kids. To help one another wrestle with these and to help one another grow, we have to work very differently. Etienne Wenger developed this idea of communities of practice. I deeply believe the engine of change in school is communities of practice working together to identify and solve problems of practice. We have to build time into the curriculum. People don't grow in isolation. They grow in community. They grow with a set of peer expectations, peer accountability, and peer coaching. That's how we're going to help one another to grow. We all have weaknesses. But what we need to do is create an environment where we can more readily acknowledge them, affirm one another's strengths, and move from there. So thank you for that wonderful question. All right, I'm checking the two ends here. We're still back here. Okay, go ahead.
Hi, Don Robbins, Houston, Texas.
Closer to the mic, please.
Don
Ms.
Robbins, Houston, Texas.
Thank you.
It's a basic question. Our school's been trying to wrap our head around this for years and years. Even a few years ago, when it was threatened, you'll be written up if you don't use enough technology in an elementary school. Trying to wrap our heads around where is the stop sign? What are the basic pieces of knowledge or math understanding or language arts that need to happen in the schools, or does it?
Well, I think Keith Sawyer is going to be much better at answering that question than I am, because he's going to talk about domain knowledge and how that's different than the kind of knowledge we've been communicating for most of the last century. But I think the short answer is that is the conversation. We have to decide what is the essential knowledge that is foundational, that will enable folks to continue to think about science as a methodology, or think about evidence in the social studies and humanities. What are the foundational core knowledge concepts? And then how do we ensure that students learn to apply that knowledge so that they retain it and have a conceptual framework? Keith's going to talk a lot more about that in the next hour. Yes, please.
So my most recent position was at a private school. I'm not there anymore, but it was interesting to hear from somebody that private schools have a lot more freedom in terms of curriculum, which is correct. Yes. But I also want to kind of bring attention to the fact that private schools are so similar to public schools because the assessment is still the same. We still have to provide a transcript. And at the private school that I was at, we had such autonomy, and I was able to produce a portfolio-style assessment in my chemistry class, and kids were really defending their work. But the issue became with the parents, because parents were like, I don't want to know about mastery. I'm not interested in how my child is progressing towards this. What does this progression mean in terms of a grade point average? Right. And so then, and you're talking about like an elite private school in Dallas, right? These kids are like matriculating to like Columbia and Dartmouth. And so they're like, I'm a legacy at UPenn, my kid needs a 4.0. And so one of the things that I struggled the most with was, even though my colleagues and most of the faculty at the school, shout out to some of them who are here today, they were really on board with this style, and I think most educators are, but the parents would then convince the kids that, what does this progression mean? Go and ask your teacher what grade this is. So as an example, in my chemistry class, one of the things I would have the kids do is, instead of writing about a titration or answering a question, I would make them do the titration several times throughout the year and assess different skills and see how they had progressed on that. But they were so scared of failing the first time. They expected to know how to perfectly do a titration. And for any chemist in the room, you know how hard that is. And I have 10th graders that are like, why didn't I get an A the first time round? So how can, now I'm an education consultant, but how can I help other teachers help students not be so scared of failing?
Wonderful question. Boy, a lot to say on that. First of all, I really only believe in 3 grades. We're talking about a competency-based curriculum. The only grades I've used for many years and can justify are A, B, or incomplete. I want to get the F word out of school entirely, for kids as well as adults. It is profoundly corrupting. The only F I acknowledge is the failure not to show up, not to try at all. Otherwise, let's talk about what the standards are for competence. And in my class, the standard for competence meant a B. And an A was reserved for real excellence. And that's very, very rare. Now, what we're going to have to do is engage and educate the parents. We can't do this without a deeper parental understanding. Parents today are petrified. They don't know what to do with their kids' smartphones. They don't know how to set limits. And they think the only way to save their kids is to get them into a name brand college. And now those name brand colleges are reinstituting SATs. Giant step backwards. But yet, what our parents don't understand is that a name brand college is no longer a guarantee of much of anything. Yeah, of that 16 out of 100 I talked about, most are going to be from the top quintile of our population, and most are going to get jobs in part because they have connections. They got an internship. We know that. That is the case. It's a very class stratified system when outcomes. But in terms of what college you go to, tell you a story. Laszlo Bock was Senior VP of People Operations at Google for many, many years. Google only used to hire Ivy League grads, and only hire those who had the highest test scores, highest GPAs. Well, he analyzed the data and discovered that all of the indices they've been using for years for hiring, thinking that's the way they get the smartest people in the world, were worthless. His words, not mine. They stopped requiring those things for admission or for a job application. Several things happened. Number one, the workforce became far more diverse. They were using structured interviews rather than transcripts to understand to what extent a young person is engaged in real problem solving, is able to collaborate and so on, is able to tolerate setbacks, failure. Secondly, their workforce became more diverse, and also the quality of work went up, not down. Because, as you just described, ma'am, kids graduating from these name brand schools, going to name brand colleges, are terrified of failure. They're highly risk averse. And the innovation economy demands that you take risks, that you make mistakes, and learn from them. That's how we go from 1.0 to 2.0. Total core contradiction between a highly risk-averse, punitive education system and the world of innovation, which demands exactly the opposite. I'm going to go here and then here. Yes, please.
Thank you, Tony. My question comes down to, like, there's a dichotomy in the classroom where, you know, we have our North Star in terms of curriculum and what we're supposed to deliver, and then you have the competencies movement that's been there for about 10, 12 years. Forget the fact that we've been doing it forever, now we're just naming it. But what I'm wondering about in this situation is it ends up in the teacher's hands, and we don't really have any scaffolding through it. Like, understanding that it's not linear, there's a continuum depending on the content and where. But like for the zone of proximal development for creativity in grade 1, and how do you develop that? And as you're going through to grade 10 in history class, let's say, like, as teachers, we're kind of winging it. Yeah. There really isn't no scaffolding to it. The work hasn't been done, or if it has been done, I'm not aware of it. I'm wondering if you know of somewheres that they are doing that work to try to help us move forward?
Yeah. No, that's a great question, and it's a huge challenge because we're adding yet more work on the backs of educators, frequently expecting them to do it all by themselves. So that's why I was talking about communities of practice. There are schools that have developed robust systems. And so I think one of the challenges as your school or you begin to move towards a competency-based system is to go learn from the folks who've been doing it for quite a while. And there's lots of them. The Deeper Learning Network has dozens of schools that are involved in an annual conference every year that is much more focused on these kinds of outcomes. There are other networks as well that you'll discover if you start Googling or even asking ChatGPT, where should I go to learn about competency-based learning? Yes, it's a valuable tool, I admit it. It really is, but you have to know how to use it. We'll go over here, please.
Hi, I'm Janet from South Africa. I know there are a lot of teachers here, and I'm actually from a university, and I think that perhaps we need to ask this question first of our universities, because schools are preparing, and I've been very involved in schools too, but schools are preparing students for university, for college. As you say, despite the statistics and how many will succeed, etc., that's what they're doing because that's what their parents want. Or sometimes, and hopefully also the students. But the way we are assessing, is it still appropriate? Because at the end of the day, and this is my biggest concern, why I'm here, I've traveled all the way from South Africa, is how does AI impact dissertations? Because that is what we are turning out professionals who've written an honors, a master's, a PhD, they've written a dissertation, and we can say it doesn't matter that they've used AI, etc. Well, it does matter, because we need some ethical boundaries, etc. So do we need to start at the top with, with the universities and colleges and how we assess, and then because schools are trying to feed through to universities, and so that's my question is, do we need to have a rethink, and do we also need to engage universities and colleges too to come on board with, just because we've been doing something forever, is this appropriate way of doing things? Is this appropriate way of assessing people?
A great comment. It is a case 16 problem. For all intents and purposes, college admissions requirements dictate the entire high school curriculum, and they have for a century since the Carnegie Foundation invented credit hours and Carnegie units. Nothing has changed, and we have to push back. But let's be clear, colleges have their own problem. The percentage of kids who are going to college is declining every single year. It's down 5% from 3 years ago. And that's not even including the decline in the demographics. The numbers of kids who are graduating from high school and planning on going to college is smaller every single year. So colleges are under tremendous pressure to reform. Not only that, in the last 15 or so years, college tuition has gone up 169%. while BA wages have gone up 19%. This is pre-COVID. So colleges have this huge challenge. And so I agree with you. It is a K-16 conversation. And the defenses of learning, whether they're in elementary school or whether they're in front of your PhD advisors, have to be meaningful and not pro forma, right? It's very hard to bluff in an oral defense of learning if you've relied mostly on AI. You wanted to ask us additional?
I just wanted to say something controversial then.
Louder, please.
Yeah, I just wanted to say something potentially controversial then, because having got a son through a system that's an internationally recognized qualification, is it therefore, are we doing the right thing, that we are educating every child so that for the 5% that might go through that system, include things in the syllabus that are beyond relevant, they're not interested, etc. We just about kill them with stress, etc. Is it, maybe this is a very bold statement, but is it appropriate that we are therefore making our students at high school, etc., their lives so difficult for the 5% that might make it? Sorry, that's just...
No, I completely agree with you. I'll give an example of a country that does it very differently. Finland was, in the late 1960s, the poorest country in Europe. They had one product, trees. Cut them down as fast as they could. Realized that was unsustainable. So they started having a conversation about how do they develop the resource of the minds of all their young people. So they completely revamped teacher education. Read Pasi Sahlberg's books, The Finnish Lessons, to learn more about this. But here's the relevant point. High school today in Finland looks radically different than almost anywhere else. You have had conversations in middle school as a student, and you get to choose between an academic track that leads straight to higher education or a career vocational technical track that leads straight to a good job, but also to college if you want. 50% of the kids choose CTE. More hands-on, mentor-based, work-based, apprenticeship-based. This is what we need to do, and that choice needs to be a choice every secondary school student can make, and not by class and not by race. I was in a very elite suburban public high school, 99% white, outside of Colorado, and I had 100 kids in front of me who were all seniors. I said, how many are going to college? Raise your hands. I said, how many would have gone through a CTE program that had been available? Half the hands went up. Half. These kids don't want to go to college. The challenge, though, is to make sure they still, if they're going through apprenticeship programs, graduate as good citizens. And that's what Finland has done very well. So thank you for your courageous, if somewhat controversial statement. We have, I think, time for just 2 more questions. Yes, you go, please.
You mentioned that you want our students to walk out of the classroom being innovation ready, which of course I agree with. We want to instill that. And then you said we should prepare them to be ready to create new knowledge. Can you bring that down to the ground level? Because what it looks like is AI, we dump a bunch of knowledge into it and it regurgitates it back to us in whatever form we want. So what is creating new knowledge? It might look different than innovation.
It's a great pushback. I think it's a part of innovation. It's when you have kids doing projects out in the community, give an example that my friend Ken Kay wrote about. They had a crosswalk in front of this high school, or actually didn't have a crosswalk, right? And kids were getting hurt, and it was dangerous. So they had a group of kids who studied traffic patterns, who studied the laws as a project, said, how are we going to solve this problem? That's creating new knowledge. They developed a proposal, and they took it to the city council, and it was passed, and they created a safe crosswalk. Those kids created new knowledge by studying a problem deeply, looking at all the different sources of information, all the different authorities had to be consulted, and developed a solution to that problem. This is happening all of the time, everywhere, in every community, in these kinds of more competency-based schools. Yes, please, last question.
I work in early childhood, which is a sector that you didn't mention at the beginning. And
that's because you guys mostly do it all right.
So that's my concern, is that in 0 to 5, we get all those beautiful questions and curiosity and wonder and lots of innovation going on, but 0 to 5 is being brought into the school system a little bit more. So my concern is, oh good, we're going to do more of what's not working and we're going to start earlier.
Exactly. What do you do if you have a failed assembly line? You make it longer.
So where does it, just taking pre-K and preschool, we're bringing it into schools. We're not bringing early educators into those schools that know about 0 to 5 brain development. We know how consequential that time in a child's life is for all that comes next. The best investment is in early childhood. What is your perspective on that, and how do we stop that from happening quickly?
Well, first of all, John had it quickly. Oh, fine. Thanks. Quickly. My kids went to Montessori schools. Next question. Seriously, again, Finland is a very interesting model. They have universal preschool. It is entirely play-based. They understand that socialization happens through play. They start school, formal school, 1 year later. They have far less homework. High school kids do an average of an hour or so of homework a week. They have many more clubs after school. They prioritize play. 15 minutes of research for every hour of academic instruction. That is a system that works. And that's part of my message here. There are, all around the world, these pockets of excellence from which we must learn. We do not have all the answers here in this country. We need to look outside ourselves for better solutions to new problems. Folks, I've got to stop, but let me end with one thing. My favorite lines from Tale of Two Cities, which no doubt you memorized in high school, the opening lines to Dickens' novel. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. In many ways, these are the worst of times in education. I don't need to tell you that. You live it every single day. But it is also the best of times. As we've heard from the audience today, people who are engaged in the real issues of our time, really struggling to understand and to make the lives of children better, and to make our country and our world a better place. So I simply end by thanking you. Thank you for the incredibly important work you do every single day. Thank you.